Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. The Storytime in Paris podcast will help keep this tradition alive with interviews and readings from your favorite contemporary authors with a French connection. Every episode features 5 questions asked by you, our authors' biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. Who knows? Maybe you'll even be inspired to write your own great French novel. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Before we get started, I just want to mention that I'll be announcing the winners of the 2 book giveaways that we've been running over the past couple of weeks at the end of this episode, so stay tuned for that. My guest this week is Janet Skeslien Charles, whose debut novel Moonlight in Odessa was published in 10 languages and awarded the Melissa Nathan Prize and the Complètement Livre Prize in Strasbourg. Her latest novel, The Paris Library, has been translated in 35 languages and became an instant New York Times, Washington Post, and USA Today bestseller. It's a #1 Indie Next Pick, a Library Reads and Lonestar selection, a Book Reporter Best Bet, and at the time of this recording, is currently a finalist for Best Historical Fiction for 2021 on Goodreads. The Paris Library is based on the true story of the heroic librarians of the American Library in Paris during World War II. Set in 2 timelines, we follow Odile, a young French woman who becomes a librarian at the American Library in Paris before the Nazi occupation and joins the resistance when the Nazis invade. And Lily, a lonely teenager in small-town Montana in the 1980s with a tumultuous home life and a mysterious neighbor. The Paris Library is a beautiful novel interwoven with romance, mystery, betrayal, the love of books and libraries and librarians, and the power of unexpected friendships. Please allow me to introduce Janet Skeslien Charles, author of The Paris Library. Welcome, Janet. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. I'm delighted to be here.
Can you tell us what first brought you to France?
Well, I grew up not far from a French war bride, and so that's where I got my interest in French. And so I took 2 years of French in high school, and I was an exchange student for a summer. For a month in the summer when I was 15. That's what first brought me to France, and that first interest came from my neighbor.
Interesting. And where did the idea for the Paris Library come from?
Well, I started working at the American Library in Paris as the programs manager in 2010, and one of my colleagues had started talking about the history of the library during the war, and he mentioned the librarians, and one was named Dorothy Reader, and I thought that was a fabulous name for a librarian. So I Googled her, and on the American Library Association archives page, I found her confidential report, which she wrote in 1941, and she talked about the days leading up to the war and the occupation of Paris. And when I read that report, I really got chills, and I really wanted to tell Dorothy Reader's story. And so that's really where the book came from. It was an open space office, so thankfully I was able to listen to what the colleagues were saying.
Wow. That's just like happenstance. It's kind of amazing.
It really is. And more than that, I took the job at the library because the building I live in was having its facades cleaned, and I live in a big modern complex. So it was just tons and tons of scaffolding going up, a lot of clanging, workers going back and forth over the windows all day long. And so it was really even by chance that I took the job just because I needed to get out of my apartment because I was going crazy with all of the work. So it really, yes, it was several coincidences that brought the story to me.
Funny, too, that you ran from someplace so noisy to a library, which is so quiet.
Yes, so true, so true. Although it was an open space, so, someone was always on the telephone. So I worked in the back office. So it was actually pretty noisy, but the library was just it was such a peaceful place. I would go from the back office. I would make excuses to go to the library, go into the library all the time. I would maybe take make 10 photocopies at a time and then put them in the slots near the door, upcoming events or the newsletters, things like that. I would parse them out so I could go just to spend time in the library.
Smart. So we got a lot of questions for you. I've narrowed them down to 5. This first question, I'm kind of squishing a few questions together here to get them all in, but a lot of people are curious about you and Paris. So what are your favorite things to do here, and what would you recommend to people coming for the first time?
Well, as an author, obviously my favorite thing to do is spend time in bookstores. And so I personally would go on a bookstore tour of Paris, which would take you into a lot of different districts, a lot of different arrondissements. I would start with the Red Wheelbarrow, which is right across from the Luxembourg Garden, and it is my happy place in Paris. I really enjoy it. I would then go to the Café 13 for a coffee, maybe a walk in the garden, the Luxembourg Garden. That would probably be my 3 first things I would do.
It's a beautiful answer. I've never thought about connecting Paris through its bookstores.
Oh, you could go from Shakespeare and Company, the Abbey Bookstore, to Galliani's on Rue de Rivoli, a little further down, Smith and Son. So yes, there are a lot of, you could do that in a day. It would be fun.
Yeah, it's a great idea. So a lot of people also wanted to know about the research behind your book. And I would like to know how do you research for historical fiction like the Paris Library and balance that research with the plotting necessary to create a compelling narrative? So how do you balance the facts and the story?
Well, I will first of all say that I don't feel like I was writing historical fiction. I was just writing a novel. And I think historical fiction is where they kind of put you in a bookstore. But I think for me, it's a novel, and probably just like any other, at least I was so fascinated by the librarians that I really wanted to read more about them. So I contacted the American Library Association, which is right outside of Chicago, and I paid to have all of their files scanned and sent to me. And it was just fascinating to read the correspondence of the librarians. So that was really probably the basis of the library scenes and getting Dorothy Reader's voice. I randomly called people with the same last names as my characters. So that's how I found Boris Nechaev's children, who live near Rouen. And I asked if we could meet and talk about their father. So I talked to his 2 children. I found there was a couple of librarians who married. They met at the library, fell in love, and married when they returned to the States. I tracked down their daughter and interviewed her. On my Instagram page, you can actually see a letter that Helen Fickweiler, one of the librarians, wrote to her daughter, and she's describing that moment when Helen Fickweiler found out that war had been declared. She was in Saint-Germain-des-Prés having a coffee with the directress Dorothy Reader, and it was just that moment and how people reacted. So I feel lucky that even today the descendants are still sending me documents and thinking of me when they see things. It was really gratifying. For how do you balance the fact and fiction? I originally wanted Miss Reader to be the main character, but I was really nervous about getting her voice right. And so what I did was I created a fictional character so that I didn't have to worry about everything she said. I think maybe now if I were to rewrite the book, having written the book, I have the confidence maybe I could now make her the main character. But at the time, I felt really nervous.
That makes sense. I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of respect here. You respecting the people who've lived through this and them respecting you with their stories too. So
yes. But, I think she never came to life in the early drafts, Miss Reader, because I was so afraid of making mistakes that she sounded very wooden. And so that's a real pity. So you kind of have to at one point say, this is not Miss Reader, this is my version of Miss Reader, and I'll do my best
That makes sense. If someone is someone you really revere, trying to write about them and do them justice, I imagine that's got to be a difficult balance again.
Well, and I really, she was just an amazing woman. Dorothy Reader came to Europe on her own in 1929. She got a job at the library, worked her way up to the role of directress in 1936. When she returned to the States in 1941, she raised funds and awareness for the Red Cross in Florida, where her parents lived before she accepted another mission, this time to go to Bogota, Colombia, where she trained librarians for 2 years. So she's just absolutely incredible. I mean, she packed a lot into her life.
Wow. Yeah, this wasn't even like it. Wow. The world of your book exists in two different timelines. How do you keep the feel of the two timelines distinct, but also fresh?
Well, I think I did a lot of research. For example, for the 1980 section, I was really concentrating on the Cold War. So I was looking back at the events. For example, the section with Lily starts in 1993, and we were looking at the Soviets who shot down a passenger plane going from Anchorage, Alaska to Seoul, Korea. And just that feeling of dread where you just didn't know what these people were capable of, or, they would shoot down passengers, innocent people in an airplane. And so I tried to find those parallels between the 1980s and the 1939, 1940, between the Cold War and the beginning of World War II, where people knew something was going to happen, but they didn't know what. And there were optimistic points and darker points.
It's sort of like nameless terror.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There are a number of really interesting characters in your book who become more interesting and more complicated as we move forward in history. I want to ask you specifically about Margaret, because she's a controversial character, I would say. Was there a specific person that she's based on, and why did you find it important to include her?
Well, I love Margaret because I feel like she represents a lot of us. Paris, for a lot of people, is a dream. It's a fantasy. It's a heaven. Maybe they came here for a week during their honeymoon. Maybe they did their junior semester abroad here. And so when they come back 30 years later, they have this idealized version of Paris in their mind. And the city is really a shock to them. And I mean, there's even Paris syndrome, where some tourists they're just are in total shock because they see the Chanel ads or they see the Louis Vuitton ads, these beautiful, beautiful images of Paris. And then, of course, Paris is like a lot of big cities, big, very busy people who can be very curt. And Margaret did have that fantasy of Paris. And when she gets here, she goes through a really hard time. She doesn't have any friends. Her friends back home have kind of moved on without her. And so I really wanted to write about how hard it is here and how much sometimes we can struggle. And I know I struggled for a really long time before I made friends and before I felt like I fit in. And I wanted to write about that. For Margaret, it's true, she doesn't always make the best decisions, but she made the right decisions for her.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because she sort of humanizes the story that we get of people, without giving too much away, of people, how people reacted during World War II, and sometimes maybe not the way that you would want them to. But because Margaret is lit this ray of sunshine in the beginning, we sort of understand, humanizes it, I think.
And you asked about inspiration for Margaret. When you open the book, there's that image of the information card of the American Library in Paris, and there's the woman in white, and we don't see her face because it's hidden by the brim of her hat. That was really my inspiration for Margaret. An elegant woman, and we don't know what she's thinking. She's dressed with this beautiful hat. So that was really the inspiration.
Oh, I love that.
We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris.
I was really struck by the relationship between Odile and Lily. At first glance, they seem like they're just completely different, two different worlds altogether, but they forge this really interesting, transformative relationship. Can you talk a little bit about how and why you created that relationship?
Well, I love intergenerational friendships, so it was important for me to include that intergenerational friendship. I really wanted the reader through most of the book to think, wow, Lily's really lucky to have found Odile, and then about the 3/4 mark to realize, no, Odile's lucky to have Lily. And I think we're always lucky when we have a friend. And I think with the intergenerational friendships, I think sometimes older people can be kind of more patient than parents are at that stage. And I mean, we're teenagers and we don't always listen to our parents. So we do need someone who can kind of reason with us. And I think that young people bring excitement and passion, which I think Lily definitely brings to Odile. So they really complement each other. I also wanted to show, sometimes I've read reviews that say, oh, we didn't really need the Montana section in this book. But for me, the whole point of the book is the friendship and the way that stories are passed down. I think without Lily, there's no story at all, because the story would have died with Odile. She wouldn't have told anyone else.
I loved the Montana part, to be honest. I found it very, very compelling. And we get most of that story, like you say, from Lily's perspective. And when it flips and I understood Odile there, it really opened everything up for me. I understood the whole book in a different way. So I agree with you.
Oh, thank you.
And now I think you're going to treat us to the reading of an excerpt from the Paris Library.
All right. Well, so we'll start with chapter 1. Odile is the main character, and we start in Paris, February 1939. Numbers floated round my head like stars. 823. The numbers were key to a new life. 822. Constellations of hope. 841. In my bedroom late at night. In the morning on the way to get croissants. Series after series. 810, 840, 890. Formed in front of my eyes. They represented freedom, the future. Along with the numbers, I'd studied the history of libraries, going back to the 1500s. In England, while Henry VIII was busy chopping off his wives' heads, our King Francois was modernizing his library, which he opened to scholars. His royal collection was the beginning of the Bibliothèque Nationale. Now, at the desk in my bedroom, I prepared for my job interview at the American Library, reviewing my notes one last time. Founded in 1920, the first in Paris to let the public into the stacks. Subscribers from more than 30 countries, 1/4 of them from France. I held fast to these facts and figures, hoping they'd make me appear qualified to the directress. I strode from my family's apartment on the city Rue de Rome, across from the Saint-Lazare train station, where locomotives coughed up smoke. The wind whipped my hair, and I tucked tendrils under my tam hat. In the distance, I could see the ebony dome of St. Augustine Church. Religion 200, Old Testament 221. And the New Testament? I waited, but the number wouldn't come. I was so nervous that I forgot simple facts. I drew my notebook from my purse. Ah, yes, 225. I knew that. My favorite part of library school had been the Dewey Decimal System, conceived in 1873 by the American librarian, Melville Dewey. It used 10 classes to organize library books on shelves based on subject. There was a number for everything, allowing any reader to find any book in any library. For example, Mama took pride in her 648, housekeeping. Papa wouldn't admit it, but he really did enjoy 785, chamber music. My twin brother was more of a 636.8 person, while I preferred 636.7, cats and dogs respectively. I arrived on the Grand Boulevard, where in the space of a block, the city shrugged off her working-class mantle and donned a mink coat. The coarse smell of coal dissipated, replaced by the honeyed jasmine of joy, worn by women delighting in the window display of Nina Ricci's dresses and Kisloff green leather gloves. Farther along, I wound around musicians, exiting the shop that sold wrinkled sheet music, past the Baroque building with the blue door, and turned the corner, onto a narrow side street. I knew the way by heart. I loved Paris, a city with secrets. Like book covers, some leather, some cloth, Each Parisian door led to an unexpected world. A courtyard could contain a knot of bicycles or a plump concierge armed with a broom. In the case of the library, the massive wooden door opened to a secret garden. Bordered by petunias on one side, lawn on the other, the white pebbled path led to the brick and stone mansion. I crossed the threshold beneath French and American flags flittering side by side and hung my jacket on the rickety coat rack, breathing in the best smell of the world, a melange of the mousy scent of musty books and crisp newspapers. I felt as if I'd come home.
I have one last question for you from your readers. Are there any plans to release this book in French?
Well, the book is in French. It came out in French before it came out in English.
Oh, all right. Well, then there's an easy answer.
And so, yes, in French, it's called Une soif de livres et de liberté, so a thirst for books and liberty, which I thought was an unusual title. But the book came out during lockdown here when we really did have a thirst for liberty and for books because the bookstores were closed. So it all worked out. I saw there was a question about someone coming to Paris and wondering what to do. And I don't know if you would agree with me or not. I'm not a travel guide, but for me, I would look at the map and see what kind of things you want to be doing and maybe find a hotel or an Airbnb in that neighborhood so you can kind of just enjoy the neighborhood on foot and not have to take so much transportation. For example, I would stay next to the red wheelbarrow because that's where I would want to spend my time. What about you? What are your thoughts on that?
I would agree. I think that Paris is best when you discover it. Mm-hmm. So I think really picking anywhere relatively central is fine. And then I would just head in a different direction every day and see what you find. Obviously, there should be some things that you hit that you're really interested in. Mm-hmm. But even now, I've been here for 11 years, and I still just like to see where the streets take me. It's my favorite thing to do. So that's what I would say. And also, find a cafe somewhere random, sit and just watch Paris pass you by, because that's also really lovely.
Yes. I think I love being outside and just walking on the streets, and I can walk down the same street 100 times and I'll notice something a little different, or the light will make it different, or there'll just be. Paris is a really busy city and there's constant construction. And so there's this constant things being improved or changed to small things in small ways. And so it's always interesting, but definitely choose a place where you can walk around and just enjoy the city.
I agree. I also think because the buildings aren't very high, we have these big expanses of sky. And so it sets a different backdrop to whatever you're seeing. So the light changes all the time too. And I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yes.
So what's next for you? What can we expect? What's coming up?
Well, the paperback will be out in December in the UK. I think it'll be out in March in the US. So I'm looking forward to the launches then. I think that'll be really nice to talk about the book again. Will you be touring? I don't know. I thought I might be, but with this new version of COVID, I'm just hoping we'll all be okay.
Yeah. It's true. It's just a big question mark right now. So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with all of your goings on?
Well, I love hearing from readers on Instagram, Twitter, then on my author page for Facebook. So my handle on Twitter is Skeslien Charles. On Instagram, it's Skeslien Charles, all attached. And Bookstagram was really a revelation for me. I think I was the last human to join Instagram or to get an Instagram account. And in 2019, my publisher suggested it, and it's been a revelation. I just am so amazed by all these young Instagrammers, their talent with photography, their kind words about the books, their insightful reviews. They really get me excited about all these new books coming out. I do an okay job of writing books, but these Bookstagrammers not only have these beautiful photos, they have a wonderful way with words. And so I'm really admirative of their talent.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I just enjoyed talking to you so much.
Thank you. Thank you again to Janet Skeslien Charles for taking the time to speak with me. Janet has very generously offered to give away a copy of the Paris Library to one lucky listener, and that listener is Sarah.Esfandiari on Instagram. My guest from 2 episodes ago, Julie Skolnick, author of Paris Blue, also offered a copy of her book to our listeners, and the winner of Paris Blue is Karen Lynn68 on Instagram. Congratulations to both winners. I envy you getting to read these books for the very first time. Please join me next week when I'll be sitting down with author Stephen Clark to discuss his novel, The Spy Who Inspired Me. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from his book. Don't forget to subscribe to Storytime in Paris on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever it is you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can find the full Storytime in Paris playlist on parisundergroundradio.com/Storytime in Paris, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Paris Underground Radio. My name is Jennifer Garrity. Storytime in Paris is produced by me for the Paris Underground Radio Podcast Network. For more on this show and to discover more great podcasts, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thank you and happy listening.